Locked in the asylum at 15 to hide her pregnancy, a cowboy broke the gate and gave her her child. The writ was folded in my breast pocket, right next to the letter I'd been carrying for 11 years and never sent. I could feel both of them against my ribs when I rode through the gate of Hargrove State Hospital for the insane on a Tuesday morning in October, 1887. The gate was iron, heavy spiked. A man could get philosophical about a gate like that, the kind that swings only one way for most of the people inside, but I wasn't there to get philosophical. I was there because a county judge named Elias Prout had signed a removal order, and because I'd told him I would see it carried out, and because I had not yet in my life made a promise I didn't keep. That's the one thing I had left by then, my promises. The rest of it, the badge, the Pinkerton contract, the house in Laramie with the blue curtains my wife had picked out, all of that was behind me. Most of it by my own hand, I'll admit. A man doesn't always know he's burning something down until he smells the smoke. By the time I smelled it, I was already standing in the ruins. My name is Calvin Rourke. I was 44 years old that October, and I had been hired by a lawyer named Moss Hathaway out of Denver on behalf of a client he would not name until the paperwork was signed. That should have told me something. It did tell me something. I signed anyway. The road to Hargrove was 40 miles of nothing, alkali flat with a skin of frost on it, sage coming up gray out of the hardpan, a sky that couldn't decide between blue and the color of old bone. I had my horse, a roan gelding named Creed who'd got me out of worse situations than this, and a deputy's temporary commission from the county sheriff, which Hathaway had arranged and which gave me the legal standing to remove a patient from the facility without the superintendent's consent. That detail, without the superintendent's consent, had been underlined in the brief Hathaway gave me. I'd read it twice. The superintendent's name was Dr. Amos Kels. He'd been running Hargrove for 19 years. The brief didn't say much about him beyond his name and tenure, but a man learns to read what's left out of a document as carefully as what's written in it. 19 years at the same institution, in a county run by one family, the Prouts, for 3 generations. A writ obtained specifically to override his authority. A lawyer who wouldn't name his client until the ink was dry. I was not, by that October, a man who surprised easily, but I will say the shape of it troubled me some as I rode. The facility appeared on the horizon like a bad idea that had been allowed to harden into brick. 3 stories, narrow windows, a perimeter wall that might have been designed for a prison if the architect had been in a more generous mood. There were cottonwoods along the east fence, leafless, their white bark catching the morning light. There was a man in a gray coat standing at the main gate, and he watched me come the last quarter mile without moving. I had the writ in my hand by the time I reached him. I didn't wait for him to speak. Calvin Rourke, acting deputy, Colfax County. I have a removal order for a patient by the name of Dorothea Voss. I need to see the superintendent. The man in the gray coat looked at the document, looked at me, looked back at the document. He had the particular expression of a man who has been trained to seem unimpressed and hasn't quite mastered it. Dr. Kels will need to review any transfer order before. It's not a transfer order, I said. It's a removal. The difference matters legally. I'd like to be inside before the temperature drops another 10 degrees. He let me in. Dr. Amos Kels was a small man who had solved the problem of being small by filling his office with large things. Big desk, big bookshelves, big oil painting of a mountain range I didn't recognize behind his head. He was around 60, had the careful grooming of a man who considers himself important, and his hands, when he took the writ from me, were absolutely still. Not calm, still. The way a man's hands go still when he's deciding something. He read it twice, set it on the desk, looked at me. "This is highly irregular," he said. "Yes, sir. Dorothea Voss has been a patient here for 31 years. Her condition—" "The writ is signed by Judge Prout," I said. "The elder Judge Prout, Elias. If you'd like to contest it, the address for his chambers is on the document." Something moved across Kels's face. Not fear exactly. More like the recognition of a particular kind of trouble he'd managed to keep at arm's length for a long time and now couldn't. "I'll have her brought to the receiving room," he said. "I'd prefer to go to her myself." "That isn't how we do." "I have the authority. I'd like to exercise it." He looked at me for a moment, and I held the look without any particular effort. This was the part of the work I'd always been adequate at, the stillness. the willingness to be uncomfortable longer than the other man. He sent a nurse with me. Young woman, maybe 25, who walked fast and kept her eyes forward. We went up 2 flights of stairs and down a corridor that smelled of pine oil and something underneath it I didn't try to name. The ward was quiet in the particular way that isn't really quiet, sound suppressed rather than absent. Shuffling. A voice behind a door talking to no one. The nurse stopped at a door near the end of the hall, room 14. She knocked once, opened it. I had been told by Hathaway that Dorothea Voss was 46 years old, that she had been committed in 1856 at the age of 15 by her own family, that she had been, as far as anyone on the outside had been able to determine, in full possession of her faculties for the entirety of her time at Hargrove, that the cause of her original commitment, as listed in the intake record, was hysteria and moral derangement. What the intake record didn't say, but what Hathaway's investigator had found by digging into the Voss family papers in Santa Fe, was that Dorothea had been 15 years old and 7 months pregnant when her father had her committed. The child, a boy, had been removed at birth and placed with a family in Colorado whose name had been scrubbed from every record her father could reach. That family's name had taken Hathaway's investigator 4 years to find. I knew all of this before I walked through that door. I'd read the brief 3 times on the ride out. It is one thing to know something from a document. It is another thing entirely to walk through a door and see the 31 years of it standing in a room 12 feet wide. She was at the window, her back to me. She heard the door and didn't turn, the kind of stillness that isn't indifference but something she'd learned because turning toward every sound had cost her too much over too long. She was slight, dark-haired with gray through it, wearing the gray dress they gave the patients. Her hands were at her sides, perfectly still. "Mrs. Voss," the nurse said. "Miss," she said without turning. Her voice was even, precise. The voice of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would not let this place take her speech from her. "I have asked to be addressed correctly for 20 years. "Miss Voss," I said. "My name is Calvin Rourke. I'm a deputy out of Colfax County. I have a court order for your release. I'd like to take you out of here today if you're willing." She turned then, and I will say I have looked at a number of people in my life in hard circumstances, and I have learned to read what they've carried. There are people who have been broken by what's been done to them. There are people who have bent. And there are people who have done something else, who have taken the whole weight of a long injustice and refined it into something that looks, from the outside, almost like patience but isn't. It's harder than patience. It doesn't forgive. It just waits. Dorothea Voss was that third kind. She was not beautiful in any soft way. She had a face that had been weathered into something sharper and more useful than prettiness. Dark eyes that looked at me the way a person looks at a document they've been given to sign, reading for what's been left out. "On whose authority?" she said. "Judge Prout, the elder." "Elias Prout." She held that name in her mouth a moment like she was checking its weight. "His family put me here." "His nephew's family," I said. "There's a difference between the branches that matters to you today." She studied me. "You know what was done." "I know what the record says, and what it doesn't say." "Then you know about the child." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know where he is?" This was the part I'd been turning over since Laramie. Hathaway had given me a name and a town, a young man named Thomas Aldridge, 29 years old, a cattle buyer in Pueblo, Colorado, who did not yet know who his mother was. The plan, as Hathaway had presented it, was to get Dorothea out first, settled, legal, and then arrange a meeting through council. I looked at her and I thought, 31 years. She has been in this room, or a room like it, for 31 years. She has not seen a horizon. She has not chosen her own food or her own hour or her own company. She has been treated as a problem that needed to be contained, because at 15 years old she was inconvenient to the wrong family. I reached into my coat, and I took out the paper Hathaway had given me with the name and the address and the description of Thomas Aldridge, cattle buyer of Pueblo, Colorado, and I held it out to her. She looked at it in my hand, then at me. "That's his name," I said, "and where to find him, it's yours." She took it. She didn't look at it yet. She folded it once carefully and held it in her fist. "You weren't supposed to give me that," she said. "Not an accusation, a statement of fact." "No. Why did you?" I thought about that for a moment. "Because it's yours," I said. "It was always yours. Everything that was taken from you was always yours." This is the part I can give back today." She looked at me for a long moment, and I had the feeling of a woman taking very careful measurements. Not of my looks or my manner, but of something harder to name. Whether I was the kind of man whose word meant what he said it meant. "All right, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Give me 5 minutes." She had almost nothing to pack. That was one of the things I had not thought through before I got there, 31 years, and what it amounted to in a room was a small parcel of books, a tin box that held I don't know what, and a coat that was too thin for October. I gave her mine. She looked at it like she was going to object, then she put it on. We walked back down the corridor past the nurse who kept her eyes forward down the 2 flights of stairs. Dr. Kels was waiting in the entrance hall. He stood with his hands folded in front of him and watched us come, and I watched his face the whole way down. He looked at Dorothea with an expression I can only describe as a man watching something be taken from him that he'd convinced himself he owned. Not love, not even care, possession. "Dorothea," he said, as we reached the bottom. "Doctor," she said, even no expression. "You understand that if you leave in this manner, I cannot guarantee." "I'd prefer," she said without looking at him, "that you say nothing further to me." He looked at me. I didn't give him anything to read. We walked out the front door and across the yard to the gate. The man in the gray coat opened it without being asked. The iron hinges had a sound, a particular low groan that I expect Dorothea had heard in her mind for 31 years as the sound of the thing closing behind her. Now it was the sound of it opening. She stopped on the other side of it, just for a moment. She stood on the ground outside the wall and put her face up, and I watched her close her eyes and breathe. The air was cold, and it smelled of alkali and dry sage and the nothing smell of wide open country. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the horizon, and what I saw in her face then I have not tried to describe to anyone, and I won't try now. Some things are not mine to put words to. Creed was tied to the post outside the gate. She put a hand on his neck. She had the touch of someone who'd been around horses before, and he dropped his head and breathed against her palm. "I'll need a horse," she said. "There's a livery in Cimarron, 14 miles. We can find you a mount there." She nodded. "Then we'd better walk until we get to a town that has one." And we did. 14 miles on foot in October is a particular kind of conversation. You don't talk constantly. There's too much ground and not enough reason. But you talk in the intervals, the way people do when they're moving together, and there's nothing to be gained by pretending the other person isn't there. She asked me what I'd been before this. I told her Pinkerton, then county work, then a period of time in Laramie that I summarized as not my best years. She didn't press. She had a way of receiving information without performing a reaction to it, which I have always respected in a person. She told me after a while, not asked, just told me, the way you tell someone something when you've been holding it so long the weight of it is the same whether you speak it or not, that she had been 15 when her father found out. That the man had been 22, a ranch hand who'd left the territory before she could get word to him, likely never knew. That she'd told her mother first, and her mother had told her father, and within a week she was at Hargrove with a paper signed by 2 doctors and her father's hand. I was not mad, she said, not bitterly, just as a fact that needed to be on record somewhere. No, I said. They knew I wasn't. Kels knew within a year. He kept me because Randall Prout, the nephew, the senator's father, was a patron of the hospital, and because I'd been there long enough that releasing me was an admission. The intake record says moral derangement, I said. Yes, she picked her way around a patch of hardpan cracked into plates. The cure for moral derangement, as practiced at Hargrove, is 31 years of being treated as though you don't exist. I thought about that as we walked. There was something in it, the specific cruelty of it, not the violence but the erasure that sat in my chest in a way I didn't have words for. I'd seen men done wrong. Shot, cheated, framed, broken, but those were active things. What had been done to this woman was an absence, a life subtracted from her, and then the subtraction itself declared to be her natural condition. She had survived it without bending. I don't know how. I asked her once, not directly, but circling toward it the way you do, what had kept her through 31 years of that. She was quiet for a moment. I was angry, she said. For the first 10 years I was angry in the kind of way that burns hot and doesn't leave you much. Then the anger changed. It got colder, more patient. I decided that if I was going to be here for the rest of my life, I was going to be a problem for them, every day, not with violence, with clarity. I was going to be the most clear-minded, exact, and inconvenient woman they had ever tried to call mad. I was going to make them know every single day that what they were doing was a lie. I kept records, in my head and then later on paper, hidden, dates, names, statements, 31 years of documentation that they could not explain away. Have you still got it? She touched the tin box she'd tied to her small bundle. Every word. I looked at that tin box on her arm. Hathaway's going to want to see that. Hathaway can want whatever he likes, she said. I'll decide what it's used for and when. I almost smiled, not at the situation, at the quality of her, the bone-deep refusal to be managed. That's fair, I said. We reached Cimarron by early afternoon. I found her a horse at the livery, a solid gray mare, older, steady, and paid for it out of my own pocket before Hathaway's expenses could complicate the ownership. Her horse, her animal. She paid me back on the spot. She had money. I hadn't asked where from, but she had it, and she counted out the exact amount and put it in my palm without ceremony, and I liked her for it. We ate at the only cafe in town that looked like it wouldn't poison us. She had not, as far as I could tell, been in a public eating establishment for 31 years. She sat with her back to the wall, and she looked at the room with the measuring expression she had, and she ordered the steak, not the cheaper cut, the good one, and she ate it methodically and without apology, and when she was finished she put her fork down and said, quietly to herself as much as to me, "That's a decent piece of beef." I told her that was the most honest restaurant review I'd heard in years. She looked at me then, and for the first time something in her face shifted from the long-controlled measurement she'd been running since the asylum. Not quite a smile, something more careful, the possibility of something lighter held back just a little still. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "you seem like a man who's been unhappy for a while." I turned my coffee cup on the table. "That's an observation." "It is." "You're not wrong. What happened?" I told her the short version, which was also the honest version. I'd been good at the work and not much else. The Pinkerton years had made me effective and made me alone in that particular order. The woman I'd married, Margaret, who'd picked out the blue curtains, had waited for me to come home long enough, and then she'd left, not unkindly, but finally, and I'd understood and hadn't argued, because arguing would have required me to promise something I couldn't deliver. I'd kept taking assignments. The assignments had gotten harder, and I'd gotten quieter. And quieter men take the harder jobs because they don't argue, and harder jobs make quieter men. By the time I'd found myself in Laramie, unemployed and about half a bottle of whiskey into most evenings, I'd had the sense that I was doing the last long coasting of a thing that had run out of fuel some years back. Hathaway's letter had come at the right time, is all. She listened to all of this without the performance of sympathy. She had a way of receiving a man's account of his own failures without the softening that I'd always found uncomfortable, the reflexive reassurance that costs nothing and means nothing. She just listened, and then she said, "You're still useful." I looked up at her. "I don't mean that unkindly," she said. "I mean you could have delivered the writ and waited outside. You could have given me the Hathaway version of what came next, which is to say, the version he controls. You didn't. You gave me the paper with my son's name on it, and you bought me a horse in my own name." She paused. "Those are the actions of a man who still knows what the right thing is. That doesn't sound like a man who's finished." I turned the coffee cup again, looked at the table. "I haven't found much use for it lately," I said. "The knowing." "Use it now," she said. "Help me get to Pueblo." There was no reason, strictly speaking, that it had to be me. She was free. She had a horse and money and a name and an address on a folded paper in her coat pocket. She could have ridden to Pueblo alone. But she asked me. And the truth is, the truth I didn't know how to say then and can say more plainly now, I needed somewhere to point. I'd been pointed at targets for so long that the absence of one had made me understand how much of what I'd called purpose was just the habit of direction. She was going somewhere real, for a reason that mattered. That was enough. We rode for 3 days. The first day was mostly quiet, the working out of how two people travel together when they don't know each other and are both, for different reasons, accustomed to solitude. She rode well, better than I expected, and she found her way back to it quickly, the way you find your way back to things your body knew before everything else happened. By the end of the first day, she sat her horse like a woman who had grown up on horseback, which I later learned she had. The second day she talked more. About her family's ranch in New Mexico, her father's land, 6,000 acres of good grass, which had passed to her brother when her father died and which her brother still ran. About the horses they'd had. About her mother, who she said she had not been able to forgive and could not explain. About the landscape, which she watched with an intensity that I realized was the intensity of a woman who had been deprived of horizon for 31 years and was now making up for lost time. She had read everything available in the Hargrove Library, and she said this without bitterness, as though she was reporting a simple fact, which had given her the particular quality of a person who has seen the world entirely through other people's accounts of it and now wanted the original. She asked me questions about the country we were riding through. Not tourist questions, specific ones. The mineral in the soil that made the alkali flats. The way the creek drainage worked through this particular range. The difference between this grass and the grass she'd known in New Mexico. I answered what I could. What I didn't know, I said I didn't know. She had no patience for the kind of man who fills ignorance with confidence, and I'd been around enough of those to have lost my own interest in it years back. On the second evening we camped on a creek bank. Small fire, cottonwood, the first hard stars coming out. She sat close to the fire and opened the tin box and went through the papers inside, not reading them exactly, more checking them the way you check on something you've kept a long time to make sure it's still there. Each sheet, each record. I watched her hands on the paper, and I thought about 31 years of careful documentation, kept hidden, kept precise, against the day it might matter. "What will you do with it?" I asked. "I haven't decided yet." She set the lid back on the tin. "I'd like to at least make it cost them something. Kels, the Prout nephew's family, maybe there's a lawyer somewhere who'd take an interest, maybe there's a newspaper." "There might be," I said. "Hathaway might know or might not want to know." "That's a good point," she said. "I'll need a different lawyer." I thought for a moment. I know a woman in Santa Fe, used to work in a solicitor's office back east before she came out here. She's not a lawyer, she can't file, but she knows the law better than most who are, and she knows who's worth trusting. "You trust her?" "She's one of about 4 people in this world I'd take at her word." She considered that. "Give me her name." She wrote it in the margin of one of her own records. Her handwriting was small and exact. That night she asked me about my wife. Not intrusively. She'd waited until I mentioned Margaret earlier, and she waited again until there was a natural opening, and then she asked, was there any chance of going back? I told her the truth, which was that Margaret had married a man in Kansas City 2 years ago and was, from what I'd heard through a mutual acquaintance, living in a good house with a man who came home at the same hour each evening. I held no bitterness toward that. It was the right outcome for her. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not the way it did," I said. "What hurts is the part I don't know how to fix, which is that I don't know how to be that kind of man, the kind who comes home at the same hour." She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "I don't know how to be the kind of woman who lives in a fine house in Kansas City either," she said. "I don't think that's what either of us is for." I looked at her. The fire was low by then, orange cold, throwing a short light. "No," I said, "I don't think it is." We reached Pueblo on the afternoon of the third day. Thomas Aldridge's office was on the main street, a cattle brokerage, straightforward, his name on the painted sign in solid letters. We tied the horses at the rail. She sat the gray mare for a moment without moving. Her hands were on the reins, and she was looking at the sign, and I could see in her face the particular quality of a person arriving at the thing they have moved toward for 31 years, and finding that the arrival itself is a different kind of event than the moving. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. After a moment she said, "What does he look like?" Hathaway's file had included a description. I gave it to her. Tall, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders. She listened with her eyes still on the sign. "That'll be his father," she said, almost to herself. The ranch hand was tall and dark. She dismounted. She smoothed the front of the coat, my coat still, and she straightened her shoulders and she walked to the door. I held back. This was not mine. I wasn't going to stand in the doorway of a thing that belonged entirely to her. I waited outside with the horses for the better part of an hour. A couple of men came and went. The sun moved a notch down the sky. Creed stood hip-shot and patient. The gray mare did the same. When the door opened, she came out first. Behind her was a tall man, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, with the look of someone who has been handed information large enough to need carrying both hands and doesn't yet know how to hold it. He stood in the doorway. His face was doing three things at once, a thing I recognized as the face of a man ambushed by something he had no preparation for. She said something to him quietly that I didn't hear. He looked at her. He nodded once. She came down the step, and he came down behind her, and they stood on the street together for a moment in the thin October sun. Not embracing, not yet. That would take time, and there was a lot of ground to cover before then. But together, on the same ground, looking at each other like two people who are slowly recognizing something they didn't know they'd lost. She turned and found me. She came toward me, and I took the gray mare's reins and held them out to her, and she took them, and her hand closed over mine for a moment before she took the rein. A brief thing. No ceremony to it, just the weight of a hand and the pressure of it. "Thank you," she said. "You did the 31 years, I said. "I just opened the gate." "That's not a small thing," she said. "Don't be modest about it." I held that. It had been a long time since someone had told me not to subtract from what I'd done. Most people, including myself, had gotten in the habit of accounting for the failures and letting the other column take care of itself. She looked at me steadily. "What will you do now?" I didn't have a ready answer for that. The honest answer was that this job had been the only thing I'd agreed to in about 18 months that had felt like a reason to be out of bed in the morning. And now it was done, and the 18 months of before was still back there waiting. She seemed to understand that. She had the specific understanding of a person who has spent 31 years with no future to plan toward, and who now had one, and recognized the paralysis that comes from the space between having been deprived of the future and not yet knowing what to put in it. "Come to Santa Fe," she said. "When you've had time. There's going to be a legal matter that'll need a man with your background and your willingness to walk through a gate without being asked twice." It wasn't an offer of sentiment. It was practical, specific, the way she did everything. "Your lawyer action," I said. "The record I kept is 31 years of documented wrongful imprisonment. Kelce's name is on hundreds of entries. The Prute family's involvement is traceable. I intend to make it cost them something, and I'll need someone who can walk into rooms that lawyers can't and ask the questions that lawyers won't." I thought about this. "I'm not cheap," I said. "I know what fair pay looks like," she said. "I've been underpaid for 31 years. I know the difference." The almost smile again, and this time she let it come a little further forward. She turned back to her son. He was waiting by the door, watching us with the slightly dazed expression of a man whose day had departed significantly from expectations. She went back to him, and I watched her straight back, direct, her step even, and I thought that I had been hired to remove a woman from a place where she'd been kept against her right and returned her to the world, and that I had done that job, and that it was not a small job, and that I had not understood until today what it might feel like to do the right thing with the whole of what you are. I'd spent a lot of years doing what I was hired for. This was the first time in a long time I'd done what I was made for. I rode out of Pueblo at dusk, west toward the mountains, the light going orange and low behind the peaks, Creed's hooves in the dirt, the smell of cold coming off the high country. I had the empty breast pocket where the writ had been. The letter I'd never sent, the one I'd been carrying 11 years, I'd left it in the hotel room in Pueblo, unfolded on the small table by the window. I'd read it one more time. It was a letter to myself, written in a bad year, and most of what it said was wrong. Not incorrect, just written by a man who thought he was already finished when he wasn't. I rode without a destination, which I'd been doing for a while, but it felt different now. Not aimless. More like pointed at something that didn't have a name yet, which is a different thing entirely. Somewhere south of the mountains, it came to me that I had, in the span of 4 days, broken open a gate that had held for 31 years, given a woman her child back, and had someone tell me not to be modest about what I'd done. That I had sat by a fire with a woman who had survived 31 years of a particular kind of cruelty with her clarity entirely intact, and who had looked at me, at the wrecked, quieted, half-coasted version of me, and said, "You're still useful." Not as flattery, as a plain assessment, the kind a person makes when they have no interest in saying anything that isn't accurate. I thought about Santa Fe, the legal matter, the work she was going to make out of 31 years of careful records. I thought about the way her hand had closed on mine before she took the rein. Not a tender thing, not a dramatic thing. Just a hand that had been alone for 31 years and understood, in the bones, what it meant to be touched by someone who wasn't trying to hold you in place. I knew I was going to Santa Fe. I had known it when she asked. Creed moved under me, steady and unhurried. The last of the day was going red across the peaks. A hawk, late, working the thermals, rode one long circle and then folded and dropped into the dark below the ridge. I had broken the gate. The gate had been worth breaking. The rest of it, what came next, the legal fight she was going to make, the work of finding out who I still was when I was finally pointed at something that mattered, all of that was ahead. Not behind, ahead. That was new. I let Creed find his own pace, and I rode into it.